Today we're going to be talking about Puritans in America. We're going to be focusing on three notable kind of Puritan authors, John Winthrop, Jonathan Edwards, and Anne Bradstreet, the female poet, talking a little bit about those writings from them, and then also some of the tenets of the Puritan faith. So get ready, here we go. When we look at Puritans in America, they are a kind of fundamental people in America who helped both found the country as we know it, but also inspired a lot of both the kind of work ethic, lasting ideology, and values that we have today as Americans. And I suppose for that reason, and their lasting impact throughout our American history, even hundreds of years later, is one of the reasons why it's important to study them, why we want to actually look at them. So let's kind of go back to the beginning of who they are, how they're different from Pilgrims, and where they came from to talk about them. When we look at them, first off, we need to consider both the Church of England, because Puritans, in many senses, began in England right around the time of the Protestant Reformation in the late 1500s. Now, essentially, Puritans saw the Church of England, saw how it broke away from the Catholic Church, and was like, that's a good start, but you haven't gone far enough. The Puritans wanted the Church of England to move farther away from the Catholic ideology. And they saw that those kind of some of the things that they held on to, like bishops and that kind of liturgy and the Mass and all that, was still too much. The Puritans wanted to focus more on not church hierarchy, but gathering together as a community and also Scripture. They were a highly scriptural and biblical theology, focused and rooted on that, in addition to this kind of almost like socialist kind of community gathering and personal faith. Now, how are Puritans different from Pilgrims? That's one of the things to consider. Pilgrims broke away from the Church of England. Puritans technically still stayed a part of the Church of England. Pilgrims went off to Holland before they came to America. Puritans just came to America and to run away from persecution in England. Those are essentially the two differences. Other than that, basically everything they believed was about the same. So we need to talk first about the kind of tenets of the faith for Puritans. Now, in many senses, they were essentially Calvinist. They share a lot of the same kind of ideology of the Calvinist faith, and they're still really tied together. Some of the main things that the kind of Puritans focus on, though, are ideas of like the nature of God, man's sinfulness, and man's relationship with God. They were very consumed with this idea of election and predestination, in addition to also man's kind of corruptness. So those are some of the things we're going to be talking about. And when you talk about Calvinism, and I suppose in Puritanism as well, there's an acronym that people use to kind of sum up the ideologies, the main 5 points of the religion, and it's called Tulip. So we're going to walk through that. So T stands for total depravity. Total depravity essentially is the idea that due to original sin, man is corrupt. He is enslaved to his passions and desires and willingly cannot choose God on his own. The U in Tulip is unconditional election, which essentially means that although man is sinful and wicked, he, from the beginning of eternity, has been chosen by God to be saved. However, is this applied to all men? Absolutely not. You thought everyone was going to heaven in this faith. Absolutely not. No, it's only a select few who are chosen to be given the heavenly gift, given access to heaven. This idea of election is also described as predestination, or also double predestination, which essentially means this: you are either destined to go to heaven or you're destined to go to hell. One or the other. But you don't really have a choice in it, since it was already decided by God way before you were born. The L in Tulip, so we're moving down the line. Limited atonement. Essentially, it means that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was enough to pay for every man's sins, but he only wants a portion of y'all to be saved. So not everyone gets in. But his sacrifice was enough to cover everybody. Irresistible grace, the I in Tulip. It essentially means that although you are a sinful and wicked creature, you cannot resist God's grace. If you are going to be elect, it's going to happen. Whether you like it or not, you are going to be elected. You will be saved. For nothing can kind of frustrate or stop God's will. Finally, the P in Tulip is the preservation of the saints. And Puritans use this word saints to describe those who are elect. And there's this idea of the living saints, the people who on earth are, by outwardly signs we can tell, are elect and are going to heaven. They are the chosen ones of God. And essentially, they will persevere till the end. And it's like irresistible grace of like, no matter what, the saints, the elect will make it into heaven. And we will know that they are elect, and that they are really elect based on their actions. Because although man is sinful and wicked, if you are elect, you will overcome that wickedness by the grace of God. And this is kind of one of those weird contradictions of the Puritan faith where it says that you are depraved and evil, but if you're going to be elect, you need to strive with your entire being to be holy and good. This was called by some the Puritan dilemma, and it is a bit of a contradiction, as Edmund Morgan describes it as such. Puritanism required that a man devote his life to seeking salvation, but told him he was helpless to do anything but evil. Puritanism required that he rest his whole hope in Christ, but taught him that Christ would utterly reject him unless before he was born God had foreordained his salvation. Puritanism required that man refrain from sin, but told him he would sin anyhow. And it's a strange kind of thing that Puritans had to wrestle with, this idea of, like, you're completely helpless, but you need to do your best not to be sinful. And it was something, though, that they struggled with on a daily basis and learned to overcome. And became part of, like, they persevered despite these kind of contradiction in ideas. We're going to talk now about some notable Puritan writers. John Winthrop, Jonathan Edwards, and Anne Bradstreet. There are a lot of other ones besides that, but those are the people we're going to focus on. Starting with John Winthrop. He was a founding figure of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and brought over a group of Puritans from England in the 1600s on the ship called the Arabella. Before they left England, he gave a speech called A Model of Christian Charity, which became a famous kind of sermon, speech, lecture, whatever you want to call it, on the primacy of America as a new nation and the Puritans' responsibility to live out their faith for the sake of others. And in it, he uses a famous biblical allusion called the city on a hill. And essentially what that is a reference to is Matthew and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in which he says, you'll be like a city on a hill, a light to the nations. You will be something that everyone will look at, so live well. And essentially, we have Winthrop re-encourage that same idea. He is telling the Puritans, you'll be a light to the world, so you must live out your faith. And this ends up becoming a kind of a notable idea throughout that the Puritans kind of grab onto, and we see it throughout their literature for the next kind of couple hundred years. And it actually, although his actual speech, Winthrop's speech, the model of Christian charity, kind of fell out of notice for about 200 years, it resurged in the 1800s, and then gained popularity again. And we actually see it referenced by JFK, Ronald Reagan, and Obama. So it still has a presence now in America. Someone who was probably at that speech and who traveled on the Arabella to the Massachusetts Bay Colony with her husband was Anne Bradstreet, a female Puritan poet who was a little bit controversial, I have to say. Although her poems in many senses represent well, I think, some of the ideologies of Puritanism and some of even the struggles of the Puritan faith, kind of dealing with those contradictions we mentioned before, she was a little bit controversial, although very popular, because in the Puritan faith, women were considered inferior to men. Although they were supposed to be taught how to read, because everyone needed to be able to read the Bible, it wasn't encouraged for women to teach, lecture, or especially write. That was supposed to be left to the men, who were smarter and had stronger brains. And there are different examples of women who were looked down upon and exiled or scrutinized for either publishing or kind of speaking their mind. Anne Hutchinson is an example of that, in addition to others as well. And Bradstreet kind of managed to get away with it, though, by kind of towing the line of being the ideal Puritan wife, expressing Puritan values, talking about her children and her husband, and also kind of not seeking out publication for herself. Her actual most famous piece of poetry, a book of poems called The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America, was actually published by her uncle. So she kind of towed the line in many senses, although she did draw some criticism. Despite that criticism, though, she became wildly popular, both in the New World and in England. Jonathan Edwards is the last person we're going to be talking about. Now, he was about 100 years after Winthrop and Bradstreet. He was a theologian and a preacher and a revivalist in America in the 1700s, and he was the one who helped kick off the First Great Awakening. So by this time, people had kind of started to waver in their faith, but he got it going again, especially with one sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which became, and still is, one of the most kind of notable sermons in American history and American literature that is kind of read throughout high schools everywhere. In this sermon, Jonathan Edwards depicts hell and also God's ability to cast man into hell at his whim. Essentially, man should never get too comfortable because the only reason why he is not in hell and suffering torments via Satan is through God's mercy. One of the reasons why it's so notable is not only this vivid imagery and its examples of like these tenets of the Puritan faith, but also because of its rhetoric. It uses rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, and pathos, in addition to all sorts of different rhetorical choices like that imagery. And that's one of the reasons why it's become such a notable piece in American history. And that's one of the things to remember about all of these authors when we look at Winthrop, Bradstreet, and Edwards, is that they're not just like these random authors operating in a vacuum. No, literature is never written in a vacuum. These are authors that are coming out of an ideology, a faith, a history, a people. And that's the American people. So we're looking at them and the Puritans because it is a part of American history, and it is a part of our history. So I hope you enjoy them. Thank you, and I'll see you later.